Welcome to Project Gamma. At Project Gamma, we have smart conversations with smart people across entrepreneurship, technology, and cybersecurity. My name is Warner Moore. I'm a technologist and security leader who helped build multiple business-to-business software as a service companies across industries. My current company, Gamma Force, we help tech and health tech companies with cybersecurity and serve as their fractional security organization. Today, we have Alex Frommeyer. After an academic background in engineering, Fro started his career as an entrepreneur, founding Beam Benefits. He scaled Beam over 14 years, serving as CEO and now chairman. Most recently, Fro founded Stack Health, which is a healthcare company focused on empowering individual ownership of healthcare. Welcome, Fro.
How's it going, Warner? Good to see you.
Yeah, you as well. Beam was founded in Louisville. I don't hear a lot of companies with a Louisville, Kentucky origin story. You raised seed capital there.
In middle of the country. And so when Drive popped up, that was a really notable event in places like Louisville. But when we had started Beam in a completely different form than what we ended up with, building over the course of the past 13 or 14 years now, capital was a totally scarce asset. And the notion of it was maybe you could pull off raising 100, 500, if you were a really good fundraiser, maybe an entire $1 million in your hometown. But if you wanted to raise real scalable capital, you were going to need to move your company and yourselves to either Silicon Valley, Boston, or maybe New York. And even just a decade or so ago, even New York was kind of a controversial pick for locating a business. There wasn't much capital there either, not for tech companies and not for startups. And so things have changed really meaningfully in terms of how much capital is in the venture industry, where it's willing to invest, and the size and quantum of capital that you can actually get access to today.
Insightful perspective. I feel like whatever narrative of the year, it seems like we talk about the same things for about 3-year cycles in entrepreneurial circles. It's but it's 2026. Where we are located doesn't matter a whole lot anymore. So let's talk pivoting. At Beam, you went from smart toothbrush to insurance. That's a meaningful change. How do you get there?
In 2012, I was really obsessed with the quantified self movement. And at that point, my two co-founders and I, who had gone to engineering school together at the University of Louisville, had become not just friends and homework friends, homework buddies, which is mostly me leeching off of their excellent studies and me, maybe not so much. But beyond that, we had started spending time together tinkering, building, and prototyping, mostly in the hardware domain space. We were really fascinated in particular by medical devices being at the nexus, in our view, of really hardcore and interesting engineering and technical capabilities fused with really amazing outcomes for patients. We thought it would be really inspirational to be able to invent something that could help, save a life or to expand a surgical capability. And the University of Louisville ended up having actually a lot of really compelling research done around the cardiovascular space. It had been the site of the first artificial heart transplant in the 1970s or 80s. And so because of that, there had been a lot of research funding, a lot of really amazing surgeons came to study and research and work there. And so we started actually working for a small medical device startup, which had been university research spun out into a private company. And we were consulting there and actually trying to help them with some of the technical aspects of a device that they were working on. And we were hugely inspired by that work. Big mission, big capability. The specific device they were working on would dramatically increase the success rate of a very specific type of cardiothoracic surgery. And so we were really compelled by doing more work in the general healthcare domain. But right around that time, 2010, 11, 12, a couple other huge things were happening in tech the emergence of the smartphone and just the insanely rapid adoption of both smartphones in your pocket and the internet connectivity plus the creation of the App Store, in particular Apple's App Store, that then proliferated. So the beginning of the app economy was really taking off at that time. And then the other big force happening was that consumer hardware was possible to do and to create affordably, or to reach a price point that would be affordable for most, middle class households. And this was due to Bluetooth. Costs of their chips were falling really precipitously, and other components were also getting much cheaper really quickly. And so now you could create a internet connected consumer device and put it at a price point that was like very affordable, mass marketable. And so it was no surprise during that era we saw a couple of hit IoT products then pop up, like the Nest thermostat, for example, was launched right around that time, and the first Fitbit, which kicked off the modern wearables and biohacking movement. So I became obsessed with this domain space because it was very similar to the work that we were already doing in the medical device world: hardware, manufacturing, sensors. It really took advantage of something huge happening in the world around smartphone adoption, and it had consumer marketing appeal, which we thought was really fascinating. So my co-founders and I ended up spending a ton of time trying to figure out what angle or what part of the surface area of this world we could capture, that we could spend time in. We were also doing some work at the time for some companies in the dental industry. My sister was in dental school at the time, and now her and her husband run a practice together in the Cincinnati area. And one of my other co-founders at Beam, his mom is a dental hygienist and had been her whole career. And so all of a sudden we had all these forces kind of converged, and we decided to create a company, which we didn't really know the phrase startup. Actually, I don't think I'd ever heard the term startup, so we just called it our company. And so we decided to start a company while we were wrapping up our undergrad educations at the University of Louisville, and started a business called Beam with the idea of creating the first internet connected toothbrush to both capture the data of the usage of the brush and the quality of that usage for purposes of teaching kids and reinforcing healthy habits, but also capturing data that could be used for gamifying that experience and ultimately helping better underwrite risk as it related to dental insurance.
That's great. I had friends at the time who used the toothbrush. And I'm just thinking of FDA pathways, getting medical devices to market, and this not being subject to FDA approval. Was that part of the decision making?
It was to a degree, and we actually ended up getting FDA approval anyway,
Oh,
because we had been, even though we didn't really need to, or it was later revealed that we didn't really need to, but you have to keep in mind, this was so early in the Internet of Things ecosystem that the FDA didn't really have guidance for IoT devices. And there was at least a tacit concern from the FDA folks that we talked to that just having sensors and chips near your face while brushing your teeth might constitute a different classification. And so we started down the 510K pathway, which would have been awful. And we were really convinced that we didn't need to do it. And we ended up doing a pretty epic 1 day road trip where we drove 7 hours to the DC area, visited the FDA to show them literally what we were building. We brought physical prototypes of the first Beam toothbrush with us. And they were like, "Oh yeah, this is fine. You don't need to do anything." And then we drove home 7 hours all the way back. But it was an early formative moment for us to actually see that we had, I guess, in some ways, the sophistication to be able to navigate tricky issues like FDA classification, but also that we were doing something so innovative, so new, that the FDA itself didn't really have anything other than a cursory look at what we were doing to try to figure out if it was something that they should have regulatory approval over.
that's great. Well worth the drive. Relative cost, time, resources of going through that approval process. Great story. So you built this toothbrush, this smart toothbrush, and now Beam is a benefits and insurance company. How did that journey happen?
It all started over a mint julep at the Kentucky Derby in 2014. So the Kentucky Derby is, the biggest event of the year in Louisville by far. And so it draws in people, from all over the world, but certainly regionally. And we had found out in early 2014 about the creation, just maybe a few months prior, of Drive Capital, which was a Columbus, Ohio based venture capital fund, but they had raised an inaugural fund that was, I think, like $250 million. Maybe there was less than 250 total million dollars in the entire Midwest that would be in investment funds for startups and tech companies. So they maybe at the time doubled the size of the entire venture ecosystem in the region. And so we had heard about these guys from Sequoia that had started a fund and had located it in Ohio. And we found out that there were a couple of their partners that were going to be guests and in town for the Kentucky Derby. And we were at the point, this was the first time we ran out of money at Beam. We were hobbling to and through the process of manufacturing the first round of the Beam toothbrush and selling them direct to consumer and through a couple channel distribution partners. But building a manufactured product is still extremely expensive, and it certainly was back then. You have to agree to all your component manufacturers to do very small runs of your molds, and your plastics runs need to be super small, very few units, just to be able to conserve as much capital as possible. So your unit costs are very high. And we had really hacked together our own supply chain to be able to get the first few thousand Beam toothbrushes built. We were hand assembling these products in a teeny tiny little office in Louisville. And we had subsidized the office down to nothing and traded equity with our landlord instead of paying rent. I mean, we were pulling out every trick that we knew just to be able to get a hardware product to market.
Equity for rent. First, I've heard that one before. Wow.
It worked out well for our landlord, and luckily he was more than game to do it. But yeah, a risky and difficult to pull off move, no doubt. But we had figured something out, and the product worked, and we were selling it, but we were still chewing through cash. And so we were completely out of money by the end of 2013. And I had actually spun our little consulting business back up just to keep my team together, because we needed cash flow and the Beam brush we couldn't afford. We didn't have the money to do another round of manufacturing to get more inventory. So we were in that classic position of chicken and egg manufacturing constraint that is still obviously one of the hard parts about doing hardware and scalable hardware. But the point was, we were looking for capital. And when we heard that the Drive Capital guys were going to be visiting Louisville, we took full advantage. So I got tickets arranged so I could attend a Kentucky Derby brunch that was always hosted at this house that we knew they were going to be at. And I show up to this party with my now wife, and we're looking out for these guys and trying to kind of wind our way through this house. And we end up kind of cornering both partners. And over a mint julep, I gave them a pretty sloppy version of what we wanted to build and what we had built at Beam, which was this piece of hardware. But we imagined that there could be an insurance relative component to it, but we weren't quite sure what that looked like and what our role was going to be in it. But we were really excited to meet them, and that we wanted some additional capital to continue scaling. And I guess impressed enough that they invited me to come up to Columbus a couple weeks later and give the full pitch to the full partnership. And it was in that meeting that I had these two slightly different pitch decks that I was keeping. As we were trying to raise money for the company, we were both positioning the business as a hardware IoT company, and that we needed capital to just continue building more toothbrushes and scaling that up. Then we had a slightly different version of that pitch as well. And so I had a second deck that said, and we're going to turn this into a dental insurance company. And my experience over the course of a year of trying to raise capital for the business, for the Series A, was that every time I pulled that insurance deck out, the meeting got like shut down. Most of them ended early. And it was because back in, 2014, insurance was considered an uninvestable category in the venture landscape because it was capital intensive, regulatorily complex, et cetera. And so I had just never gotten traction with that pitch. And for whatever reason, when I went to Columbus, I pulled the insurance deck up, and I got to the second slide, which kind of, proposes that there's 100+ million Americans that don't have dental insurance coverage. And we can use this novel combination of the hardware and the underwriting insights to be able to better understand who's actually low risk and could therefore get initial coverage for way less than they would get on a typical policy. And Chris Olson from Drive Capital stops me. He's like, hold on, are you saying you want to build an insurance company? And I was like, oh man, I pulled out the wrong deck yet again, because here's going to be another, super smart venture firm that passes on us because insurance is obviously an uninvestable category. But I admitted it. I was like, yep, I really think that's the right thing to do for this company, and the place that we should take this piece of hardware and this unique stream of data. That's what we should do with it. And he said, look, we've been doing a bunch of thesis work on insurance, and we actually think there are compelling businesses that nobody's thinking about that could be built in the insurance domain space. And so we've been looking for founders just like you. And that's what ultimately became a huge sigh of relief for me in the near term. But ultimately, I moved my two co-founders and then our first employee to Columbus later that summer. And we've been building Beam and in Columbus ever since.
That's a really interesting story. I hadn't heard how you were a part of Drive Capital going after the insurance space. Our first Project Gamma guest, Dan Manges, co-founder of Root Insurance, was also insurance investment from Drive Capital at the same time. Company went public, and that's super cool. You were influential on that. You mentioned it in passing, but I think there's something more there, how you ran out of money at Beam. So you ran out of money twice at Beam and at different stages of the company. That's difficult. Payroll, cash flowing operations, investor pressure. What lessons came of that running out of money?
Well, the initial Drive investment was actually very notable for us internally, because when I say we ran out of money, I mean we were in the negatives by the time we raised the Drive round. We actually had a negative $10,000 balance in our bank account. So when Drive put the first tranche of capital from our Series A through the wire, I think it was $1 million that came first, but we only netted 990 because we were actually digging out of a hole in the bank account at the time. So we were running on true fumes.
Did you take
But the second time we ran out of money was about 18 months later. We had moved to Columbus and we had expanded the team and started really building with, real resources for the first time. But we were doing something totally new and ambiguous, because at that point, our entire experience had been building hardware, manufactured goods, devices. And while we had the CAD modeling and the supply chain building and the electronics design pieces, quite mature and figured out, what we didn't know anything about was how to build an insurance company. And you know what? Very few people at that time did. Dan is actually a great example of this, where he was helping get Root started around the same time. And so there were a few of us in Columbus, and then around the country, companies like Metro Mile from David Friedberg and Oscar Health with Josh Kushner and Mario Schlosser had started building de novo risk-bearing insurance companies, really for the first time in a generation. But there were a few of us who didn't really know each other at the time, who were working on the regulatory filings and setting up captives and buying shell companies and working through all these consultants and doing Department of Insurance filings in different states, really for the first time. And so we had to build this first principles approach to what was the right way to construct an employee benefits company that could sell in a variety of different states and manage risk in a productive way. And so we ended up coming up with a structure that worked. And so we were spending capital and time and effort on that. We were trying to build out more software to accomplish the various tasks of an insurance company, collecting premiums, paying claims, processing those claims, and quoting enrollments. There's a lot to it that kind of sits beneath the surface of managing a unit of risk. And so we had done all the work to set it up, but we were lacking something pretty critical to being able to build a company in the insurance space, which was initial regulatory approval, which meant that at least one state, Department of Insurance, needed to accept us and admit us into their state such that we can sell a policy. And so while we were very bullish internally about having built a really compelling and unique product in dental insurance, obviously something very novel and differentiated, I couldn't prove it in the form of sales that the customer cared about it at all. And so what we had built was all of the lead up infrastructure to being able to launch what became a high product market fit company, and one that's expanded dramatically since then. But at the time we had, zero sales, zero brokers, zero regulatory approval, and we were still running that burn every month. And so we got to this point in 2015, 16, where we were out of capital again. We needed some bridge financing from Drive, but really had nothing to show for our efforts and no proof that there was a real company there. And so that led to not only having to lay off 2/3 of the business, going from 24 people back to 8, a true bare bones team. But we also didn't know, even with financing, if the company was going to make it. And throughout that period, I also got fired as the CEO of the company. And so the company was also without its effective leader or any leader for some period of time throughout that process as well.
How do you get through it?
I think a lot of it was around kind of two forces. One was me realizing I needed to transform myself as a leader and really understand how to leverage my board, my investors, and become a leader that could lead with transparency and information in a way that I hadn't really done. In fact, I had kind of been running for the previous 18 months with as little transparency as possible, because we were also essentially winging it as we were building out this insurance company for the first time. And so in many ways, I didn't even know how to represent the progress that we were making because I didn't have context for it. And so that led to a ton of discomfort around and insecurity around, am I even doing this the right way? Am I doing it actually super fast and efficiently, or slow and sloggy? I had really nothing to compare against with no prior experience in the field. And so I transformed myself as a leader and really became obsessed over time with company culture and how to think about building teams, constructing boards, communications at all these different levels and different messages. And then the second force was really my relationship with my two co-founders. And really also Patrick, who was our first employee, who had come with us from Louisville, who I'm working with again now at my new company, Stack. And, the four of us had to kind of choose to really decide that this is what we wanted to do. We had come to a different place than where we were from. We had decided to build this company and really ramp up the ambition. And we had to decide and kind of double down in this, crucible moment. Did we want to, keep going and plow ahead and figure it out and get the company through this time, this meaningful cash crunch, and where we're laying people off and where our reputation locally had to have been pretty negative because nobody knew us before. And then we showed up to town and then immediately started hiring and then summarily firing people. And the alternative was we could just give up and shut the company down and go back to Louisville and start something new, or get the jobs that our parents probably would have preferred that we would have had for some steady income. And we had to decide that no, we thought that there was the merit here and that this was worth going through together. And it ultimately bonded us much closer together as at the human and personal level. And it formed the core of what became just a really unique and incredible company culture as the company did figure it out and did begin to expand.
I know we're going to dig into culture in a little bit here. Something that I'd like to explore a little further is I've seen people go through that situation and either not come back from it as a person, right? A CEO, founder, no longer in the company. The Steve Jobs story is glamorized and rare, right? So they might come back to it many years later after some hard-earned lessons, or maybe not at all. And you mentioned leadership. What were some of the experiences, the resources, books, learning, whatever? What were some of the things that helped you grow so quickly as a leader to go back to your previous role?
Pretty formative couple of books, and then I would say just like the related information ecosystems built around these people and their books were really formative for me at the time. One was Ben Horowitz's The Hard Thing About Hard Things, which I read for the first time in that time period. And then the second was Peter Thiel's Zero to One. Both were really incredible for relatability around not just how to think about, building a company, et cetera, but I think even maybe the tagline of The Hard Thing About Hard Things is something like what to do when there's no good options left or something along these lines. I was like, oh, that resonates. I'm I'm running a company that has no money and I'm no longer in the driver's seat of that business. There's a lot of feelings and emotion around processing my relationship with my co-founders, my relationship with our employees, both past and present, and what it's going to take to continue to exist. And is this really what I want my life's journey to be? And do I even really want to be an entrepreneur the way I thought I did when I first got started? And so there's a lot of processing to do there. And both of those books were really formative to shaping the frameworks on how to think, and the relatability of now very famous and successful people have also gone through PayPal for Peter Thiel, huge near death experiences, running a huge burn and narrowly escaping in their exit. And Horowitz going into incredible depth about his own struggles, building and machinating multiple companies through his operating career. And I think one of the broad conclusions that I drew then and still draw today is that there is incredible value to building something that you believe in with people that you believe in for the purposes of accelerating the goals of society and your worldview for what society can and should aspire to. And those are deeply motivating things, much more motivating than the hard things resulting from that, which is, yes, from time to time, you may have to do an incredibly difficult fundraise, or you may have to change your role in a business or transform yourself and your experience as a leader, or do a layoff or pivot a product. And we've had all those experiences building Beam over the years, but we've done it in sympathy for the society that we want to see emerge from our efforts and our goals as a company. And we've done it with incredible people and have stayed really true to our principles along the way. And so I've always been motivated to get up on a Monday morning and be excited to go into the office to continue chipping away or toiling on that work, because it does ladder up to something much bigger than ourselves, much bigger than even this particular company. It's part of the project that we want to create more broadly.
You built a lot of value, like doing a difficult thing in Beam at the time. It probably would have come through in a balance sheet, but all the very difficult business stuff of creating an insurance company. But you hadn't been approved in a state yet, so revenue, etc. The business fundamentals were challenged. You ran out of money. How do you get through that? How do you recapitalize the business?
We ultimately received some bridge financing from Drive, and to a degree, I think got lucky in that we had filed for admittance to multiple different states, and actually California, not typically known for being a regulatorily easy state to work with, but they admitted us pretty quickly after all of this drama and this episode of leadership vacuum and the cash crunch played out. Within 2 or 3 months, we ultimately got admitted. And so then I found myself in restaurants around Columbus at night, sitting in the back, hand loading leads for brokers into Salesforce so I could run campaigns, because a new challenge, of course, had emerged, which is, okay, now we can sell policies in California. Now we have to find some customers. And the customers were living inside the books of business of employee benefits brokers that were operating in the state of California. So I was researching and cold outreaching to brokers all over the state. And we were very fortunate to find a handful of brokers who would give us some of their, attention and some shots on goal for some of their clients. And we quickly found that our theories around the differentiation that Beam's dental product had were actually true. And so within 6 months, we actually were running a 1 million ARR run rate, and we had found and sold real volume to a real customer, and we had found the early essence of product market fit.
It's great. 0 to 1 million ARR in 6 months. And you went from doing a bunch of very difficult things to another hard thing, right? Building out the initial sales and growth engine. So, wow, heck of a ride there. You built a big thing before and successful in many ways. You founded Stack Health with 10 million seed funding from 8VC. That's huge. Why this path?
One thing that Beam's success really brought us to the front seat of is the just incredible difficulty that small and medium-sized businesses have all over the country in managing the cost and complexity of healthcare and health insurance in particular. And there's a lot of reasons for it, which maybe isn't in scope for today's conversation, but the net effect of the cost and complexity of health insurance is a real drag on expanding employment and the expansion potential of small businesses all over the country. And we would hear this all day, every day from these companies and their brokers, because this is the exact customer that Beam sells to. Beam is in the benefits domain space, but we sell everything except health insurance. And so over the years, I felt very fortunate to have all of these really successful relationships with these employers. But all the time, the number one piece of feedback we get from our customers is, thank you for solving, dental and vision and life and disability and all these benefits for my employees. But can you please solve health insurance? Because that's the one that's really hurting my business, and it's hurting my ability to expand my business. And so I ultimately woke up maybe 18 months ago now and realized that if I was serious about what I said earlier, the opportunity to build a company that produces a dividend for society and not just financial success or social status for myself, then I should be taking this health insurance problem and opportunity much more seriously. And so I ultimately decided to hire a new CEO to take over for me at Beam and to move into the chairman role so I could free myself up day to day and go back into operating, back to the 0 to 1 moment, and actually not just start a new company, but start one that is even more ambitious than Beam and aims to solve, I think, an even more complex, difficult, and valuable problem for the American economy broadly, and certainly small businesses inside of it.
Well, if there's anything that's the through line here, it's you keep on running towards the hard things. It's the act of scaling a business and transitioning from operating CEO to hiring a CEO, yet another hard thing, and back to building from zero. And you've been building companies for a long time now, Fro. Gone through ups and downs, had headcount up to 350 at one point. You mentioned this before, culture. What are some of the lessons you've learned about culture and building teams? How are you applying those lessons intentionally now in Stack Health?
Yeah, there's so many lessons, and experience may vary here too, because culture is one of the most talked about but difficult to grasp topic areas because of its nuance and how much of it actually is a direct result of or is directly downstream of the founders personalities and their worldview, as well as the original sins that every company commits, whether it realizes it or not. But those things stay with a company forever and is baked into the ethos of that business, for better or for worse. And so one thing I spend a lot of time on when I'm with founders and cultures around or topics around culture come up is that I think there are two markers of the best cultures. And they are very simple. One is that they are very distinctive in nature. And the second is that they're written down. And I think both are actually very important elements. Too many of us as entrepreneurs, including me when I was first getting going, coming out of Kentucky, a place where there's not a lot of startups and tech culture already existing, was that you end up looking at other companies' cultures, their values or their mission or how they approach hiring or how they operate their companies internally. And you try to mimic it because you admire it. And there's a lot of mimesis that comes from the lack of having your own view. And if we've learned anything, I think, as a startup or tech community, especially in the most recent few years, is that there are more examples than ever of companies who have proudly and securely shown how distinctive and unique their culture is as a mechanism to both attract and reject the right coworkers and teammates, and to attract and reject, to a degree, the right customers as well. And so I think of companies like Anduril, who have done an amazing job of kind of carving their own unique path where they have this unique business model and this unique cultural ethos as great examples of this, where it's very difficult to replicate, and you shouldn't even try to replicate a culture as distinctive as Anduril. Uber had this 10 years ago. They were running a very specific strategy, and that company oozed Travis Kalanick, the founder's, his personality was infused into the Uber business strategy. And then all of these people that were operating globally and scaling as fast as they were. It's a very specific moment, very specific company, very specific culture that you can't easily replicate and bring into other disparate industries or with other founding teams, though many have tried. And maybe most unique of all right now, in my view, is what Alex Karp has done for 20 years as leader of Palantir, a company that has spent many moons as the pariah of Silicon Valley and has now become much more trendy and consensus. But it's already, I think, a 20, maybe even over 20-year-old business. And so they have always stayed true to a very unique set of principles. And there are many other examples out there, but what I always admire about the best company cultures is not the ones that I necessarily agree with, but the ones that are unmistakably authentic and unmistakably themselves. And you just couldn't take Alex Karp, for example, and drop him into CEO of Costco and expect good results. It just very obviously wouldn't work. Costco is a completely different business and a completely different culture. And he and the Costco ethos probably wouldn't mesh, wouldn't work out well. And the second component of this, which I think is much easier, but still very rare, is that the best cultures are also written down. And the reason why this is important is that, especially in the early stages of building a company, defining what you care about is worth not just thinking through, but memorializing. It's an incredibly helpful and, by the way, effective recruiting tool as well. Because if you can put a document, I use both memo form and like a deck form for this, but if you can put a document in front of your employee or a prospective employee and say, this is what we care about, it gives that person the opportunity to either accept or reject that as alignment from their own personality and their own interests. But the people that will work for you are going to, from day one and from moment one, love their experience because they will have had their expectations set up front around a company that clearly knows what it stands for and has done the hard work of defining that and being frankly willing to lose key recruits or potentially key customers in favor of staying true to those principles. And what turns out to be true is that the most talented people not only want to work with, yes, other talented people, but they also want to work in a company culture that they're aligned with and that they actually understand. And too few companies can even define what they stand for because they haven't done the hard work of inspecting their own company and inspecting themselves to understand what is our authentic set of principles and mission and why are we here and who are we and what are we about. But by doing that work, you'll find actually a lot of other hard decisions in a business to be made much more easily because you can just start with your own stated culture and your own principles and your own mission and work downstream into making the hard day-to-day decisions around personnel or strategy. And so I think those are really useful things is know what makes you distinct, write those things down, and then as aggressively as you can or want to project those distinctions into the market, and you'll find it much easier to attract and retain talent and much easier to attract and retain customers as well.
I like that. I agree. Writing it down is super important. It's one of those things that the startup culture we sometimes put off. I spent nearly a year analyzing and working on company values here at Camo Force, and they're all written down. You can see them on our website. In my career, I've done some pretty big things, but sometimes I think about how my career has been focused on money, or maybe it could have been bigger, solving bigger problems. For a successful company, we need profit, sure. And the work I've done has been impactful, but it also wasn't interstellar travel or new sources of energy. How do you approach the idea of impact in the work you do, Fro?
I am really compelled by any opportunity that ladders up to this idea of building what I call societal dividend company. And it's a very simple notion, articulated a lot around impact today. But what it means to me is that if this company is successful, whatever that particular business is in question, it will create not only a successful business outcome, but there will be some sort of dividend that society will receive as well. And the reason why this is important is because what we do as builders, leaders, operators, founders, entrepreneurs is incredibly hard. And I think maybe some people can just be so intrinsically motivated that they just like doing really hard things for the sake of them. But I think most of us, and this certainly describes me, I need to be motivated by the big picture to get through those hard eras that companies, while they're being built, inevitably go through. And so to me, I need to feel like what all this is for is some sort of benefit to society, something much bigger than me, my coworkers, my co-founders, my immediate family, my extended family. Those are all motivating for many people. They really think about who they're building for as authentically themselves. Maybe they're building for their kids and their legacy. Maybe they're building to make their alma mater proud or the city that they're building in proud. And those are all super legitimate. I love building for the benefit of society. And so taking one of our society's 5 hardest problems and taking that one off the shelf and saying, hey, if nobody solves this, we're going to be in a measurably worse place, really motivates me. And being able to do that in the context of the American healthcare system and health insurance, I think does qualify as one of our most meaningful problems today. And that's perhaps the only reason I felt it relevant to leave what I was doing at Beam and choose to go 0 to 1 again.
I like that. And thanks for building it in Columbus, and thanks for the work you're doing. I think taking that approach to impact is something we all can do, but don't necessarily do. Do you have any closing thoughts, books, anything more you'd like to share with our audience?
I was I just came across this weekend, so it's relevant. I'm just wrapping up a really amazing book called The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt. And I actually didn't know this, but in the Badlands in the Dakotas, the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library is just getting ready to open. Spectacular piece of architecture. And it's somewhat unique in that it's a presidential library that's being built 100 years after he was president. So unique asset that the country now has, and I think it's opening soon. And so there's this really great, I think, discovery or rediscovery for some of Teddy Roosevelt's presidency. And I found it really fascinating. This particular book, The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, is about his teenage years and early years where he went through an enormous amount of personal tragedy. His wife and mom died on the same day. And he was, I think, probably in his early 20s when this happened. And it totally shaped his personal views around like love and life, etc. But he's the sort of person that I think would probably resonate with what we're talking about today in making sure that the accomplishments of any given person, leader, company should have some sort of dividend to society. And Teddy Roosevelt was this type of person, love him or hate him. And he was controversial in his day. And, we always have perfect retrospect 100 years later, so we can examine these things differently, but certainly a hugely principled person. And he's got this famous quote around the man in the arena, which I think has lived on quite successfully. And that's always deeply resonated with me as well, which is if we've got this long list of incredibly hard and compelling problems that society needs to solve, and not enough people are stepping into the arena to tackle those problems, then that is the moment that our true leaders in society should be stepping into the arena. You can do this in so many different ways. It doesn't just need to be for-profit, private, high-growth, venture-backed tech companies. I do think that's a particularly useful tool or mechanism for achieving rapid change and growth and innovation in society. But there are many ways that you can impact these hard problems. So maybe what you take away from reading this book about his life is just you're deeply motivated to get in the game and find the big, hard, chunky, meaningful problem and really go for it. And if you're lucky, you get to spend your life's work. It gets to be a reflection of attempting to solve these problems. And there's a lot of merit in just trying to solve these problems and being one of the hopeful contributors to a better world.
There is no destination. Well, thank you for listening to Project Gamma presented by GammaForce.io. If you've enjoyed this podcast, check us out on your favorite podcast platform to catch future episodes.